Megan Swick, and thank you for joining me tonight for Ernest Bloch, a man of many influences. Ernest Bloch was born in Geneva, Switzerland on July 24th, 1880. Interestingly enough, he did not come from a musical family, but still began to study music at a young age. His passion for music began when his mother bought him his first instrument, which happened to be a flute. He took a wide variety of lessons, which included violin lessons from Louis Rey at age 9 and composition lessons from Jacques Docrot. He briefly left Switzerland to continue his studies in both Germany and France and went to college in Brussels. Then, in his 20s, he moved home to work on his father's clock business. 5 years later, a highlight in his musical career took place when he began conducting in Lucerne. A year later, Bloch lectured on aesthetics at the Geneva Conservatory. Bloch then moved to the United States in 1916 when he went on tour with a dancer. A year later, for the first time, one of his pieces was performed, which led to him being invited to join the faculty of the Mannes School of Music in New York. He also, later on, taught at the San Francisco Conservatory, and he was granted U.S. citizenship in 1920. Around this time, Bloch composed one of his most famous pieces, Macbeth, which is an operatic setting of the Shakespearean play. Here, we have Macbeth being performed at the Manhattan School of Music, And this piece is actually still being performed to this day, which I find to be kind of cool. Bloch's compositional style changed throughout the course of his life. Bloch is known for his Jewish heritage. Bloch was born from Jewish parents and had his own composition period that is known as the Jewish cycle, which lasted between 1911 and 1918. He composed large-scale biblical pieces that were filled with fourths, both perfect and augmented. The perfect fourth is a consonant interval with very little tension, whereas the augmented fourth, known as the tritone, has been referred to the devil's interval. So the two being used together in this context is actually an interesting application of these two intervals. Bloch was very particular with his rhythmic accents in these pieces. They resembled how the language of Hebrew would sound. This dice is emblematic of patter style, which is used in many operatic works in general, as well as his Jewish cycle. One major reason why he's seen as a Jewish composer is his use of modes. Throughout his pieces, he would often use Aeolian, Dorian, and Phrygian modes, which are commonly associated with Jewish music. There will be more discussion on Bloch's use of modes later on in the lecture. Bloch himself actually denied any of these conscious claims of using Jewish music throughout his compositions, which would lead one to believe that his inspiration came from a lifetime of his own Jewish, religious, and other influences. Ernest Bloch had a love for American music. He ended up composing a piece, America, an Epic Rhapsody. This piece was the first piece in a Musical America contest, and it took first prize in 1927. This piece was interesting because it was dedicated to Abraham Lincoln and Walt Whitman, but the inspiration for the melodies came from indigenous themes. These themes would include Native American motifs, sea shanties, and patriotic tunes. His love for America can clearly be seen by his use of American melodies and also by his choice to become an American citizen. Though Bloch was a citizen of the United States, he did still spend a good amount of time of the 1930s in Europe composing large-scale works. During this time, he composed a violin concerto and a Jewish sacred service. When Bloch returned to America, he began to teach at the University of California, Berkeley. His teaching at Berkeley was very critical because it would ensure that he would still have U.S. citizenship during World War I. His compositional style became more experimental as he entered the neoclassical and neo-romantic era. He even composed a 12-tone piece titled the 12-tone Sinfonia Breve. Around this experimental time, Bloch also composed the Suite Modale. Ernest Bloch had a wide variety of inspirations throughout his career. One love that Bloch had was for German Baroque music. He greatly admired the work of J.S. Bach as well as Beethoven and did not hesitate to steal elements from their compositions. This is very apparent in the Suite Modale. Bloch combines Baroque elements with his own compositional style, which is one of the reasons why this piece would fall under the category of neo-Baroque. Bloch also enjoyed works of Eastern compositions. He would put pentatonic themes throughout the pieces. This can be seen in the viola suite and the suite modale. One last influence that Bloch had was fresh impressionist music. This is one of the first compositional styles that Bloch chose to write in. His piece, Hiver Pratum, there can be seen the modal cast and cyclic construction, and they are introduced and become key features of Bloch's compositions to follow. Throughout his student compositions, an interesting influence that can be seen is Richard Strauss. This was in regards to melody and harmony and also orchestration. Bloch was always gathering from different eras. Even his most abstract compositions would still have influence from both the classical and Baroque eras. In some of his violin sonatas, one can even see influence from Gregorian masses, specifically the Kyrie. Bloch was a creative composer who sought influence from many different outlets and combined them throughout his pieces to create interesting effects. Now we move on to the suite modale itself. This piece is based on Baroque suites. This piece consists of 4 movements: moderato, lo stesso tempo, allegro giucoso, and adagio allegro decouso. Typically, the Baroque suite will consist of multiple dances that are all the same key. A Baroque suite is structured to have 4 movements. These are known as the allemande, the courant, the sarabande, and the gigue. The interesting thing about the suite modale is that it does not follow this form exactly. It does open with a moderato movement, which would resemble the allemande. Then, things begin to change in the second movement. The Baroque suite follows a slow, fast structure. Here, the second movement is titled lo stesso tempo, which translates to the same tempo. Then, we get our fast movement with the allegro giucoso. Interestingly enough, this is the movement that would be closest to the gigue that a normal Baroque suite would end with. Then, here's in the fourth movement, things switch between slow and fast phrases, which would engage the listener. The beginning with multiple slow movements can be seen in Handel's piano suites, specifically his suite in F-sharp minor. This is a similar template to be with the suite modale. This piece is 12 minutes in length and is meant to be played with very little space between movements. It was composed at the end of Bloch's life and was dedicated to American flautist Elaine Schaefer. After she commissioned the piece, Bloch expanded on it to be orchestrated. Bloch admired Schaefer's playing, even though he only got to listen to her perform on recordings. When it came to her playing, Bloch saw a sense of youthfulness, freshness, and that she had a way of being able to express complex emotions and aesthetics, which he implemented throughout the piece. Though this still has religious modal influence, it is very different from Bloch's other pieces. Schaefer also ended up editing the piece and sending Bloch her own interpretations. Now we move on to movement 1. This movement has flowing passages, and the flute tends to echo the accompaniment. This movement would in many ways resemble a prelude. This is much like the Handel piano suite referred to earlier in the lecture. A major thing about the structure of this movement is that it has one major motif, A and A prime, that continues in variations throughout the movement. In later movements, the following examples are where this motif occurs that we can call the A section. 4 variations of the single melodic idea in the middle section serve as a transition between the phrases. These are outlined as follows: A, B, C, D, A, B, C, A. I will have you listen for the beginning of each of these sections so you can hear them throughout the actual performance. Judging by the title of this piece, one can deduce that the modes play a major role in the structure. Bloch has 11 modes, which would make sense based off his Jewish religious compositional background. His preferred modes to compose with were Phrygian, Aeolian, and Dorian, which would be very apparent throughout this piece. Taking a look at the movement specifically, the majority of the movement tonicizes the pitch E. With the key signature, that would put the piece in E Phrygian. Phrygian tends to have more of a mystic and non-Western feeling to it. Then we move to the D section we listened to earlier. There is a shift to more of a minor feeling. This is because the piece moves to A Dorian. This briefly tonicizes the pitch A and serves as a transitional piece back to the main melody, in addition to something to stand out to the listener. This also works as a fairly smooth modal change because the pitch A would be part of the minor 4 chord. Since the Dorian mode begins on a minor 1 chord, this would serve as a pivot chord. The remainder of the movement stays in A Dorian, and since the pitch E is the 5th of the minor 1 chord, this movement is able to end in a variation of the opening theme, which is very important to the structure. Something that can be seen as important throughout this piece is the dynamics. There is really not a single phrase throughout this whole piece that does not have any kind of dynamic marking. Throughout this movement in particular, there are many places where the melody rises in pitch and the volume will get louder. This is to shape the phrases and give them more of a general contrast. This movement also has a dynamic range that stretches from a piano to a mezzo forte. This means that Bloch wants contrast, but he still wants to keep the movement soft and flowing and save the louder expression for the later movements. Another way that Bloch is expressive with his phrasing is his placement of slurs. The amount of slurs tells the performer exactly how he envisions each individual phrase to sound. Throughout this movement, there is not a single phrase that does not have a slur on it. This is important because it shows which note is emphasized. In the following example, both the location of the slur and the tenuto markings tell the performer that the pitch D and F are where the phrase are going. With all of this, more important expressive devices that Bloch uses are retardandos and slitandos. In this movement, those are being used to show where the cadences are to signal the end of an idea. All of these are meant to be a gradual slowdown in the measure. Here is an example of the effect that Bloch creates by slowing down in these places. Now on to movement 2. Right away, the name of the movement translates to the same tempo. This makes the piece unique because typically composers like to have movements that contrast each other. Though this movement has many similarities to the previous movement, it definitely is its own. With that being said, one can definitely argue that this movement is a continuation of movement 1 because of the tempo markings and even some of the phrases. One difference between this movement and the first movement is that there are themes that are introduced that actually feel slower. This is because they have more eighth notes, and then movement 1 was filled with more 16th notes. This movement has a main phrase that repeats a few times. Here is that phrase to listen for. Overall, the form of this movement is A-A-B-A-C-A. The thematic material in the B and C sections should sound familiar. This movement expands on the melodic material that is present in movement 1. These phrases always lead back into the main motif of the movement. Movement 2 starts in A Dorian. This works because it allows for a smooth transition between the movements, since that's where the prior movement ended. Then, around rehearsal 7, the piece moves into E minor. This is when the main A theme returns. This is a brief change. From there, at measure 33, the piece shifts to H Phrygian. The reason for this shift is that it quotes the thematic material in the prior movement. Using the same mode would be important here to ensure that it gives off the same effect. This movement then remains in A Phrygian for here on. Overall, the dynamic markings of the second movement are very similar to that of the first. This is, in some ways, to be more dramatic, given that there is one measure phrases where there is a crescendo, and then immediately after a decrescendo, or even vice versa. Also, in measure 28, the phrase ascends, but the dynamics get softer. This is an interesting marking because it goes against what the line would typically want to do. The purpose of the slur is one that matches movement 1. They create phrases that are a way for Bloch to communicate with the performer exactly how he wants his phrasing to happen. This movement holds many similarities to movement 1. The tempo is the same, the phrasing is the same, and the overall compositional style is the same. Now on to movement 3. This is where the contrast begins. Right away, the title gives away. Allegro giocoso means that it's a lively, bright tempo. Another major difference is the change in meter. The other movements were in a simple triple 3/4 meter. Here we move to a compound duple, which would be 6/8 time. This movement is meant to be more of a dance and would closely relate to the jig in the traditional Baroque suite. This movement introduces new thematic material. To go along with the change in meter, this movement hits its own, and it does not quote any other movement that we've heard in the prior two movements. It does, however, have a very specific structure. This movement is ternary, or an ABA form. The A sections are in 6/8 time mentioned above, and the B sections start at rehearsal number 12 is in 2/4. This is a shift from a compound duple into a simple duple. Much like the other movements, this movement too has a main theme that continues throughout. This theme occurs 3 times throughout the entire movement. There are also some smaller themes that follow the main theme. These can be seen as the smaller B sections. These are a part of each larger A section and occur twice. Just like how many other things are different about this movement, so are the modes that Bloch chooses to use. This movement starts out in A Dorian until the end of the first phrase, where it resolves in E minor. And then at rehearsal 12, this is where the piece slows down and there is a meter change to 2/4. Then it moves to a very familiar Phrygian. The difference here is that the piece is now in G Phrygian to reflect the key signature of the movement. It is likely that Bloch chooses to resort to Phrygian here because the thematic material in this section is very similar to that of the prior movements. Then, as the meter changes back to the A section returns and the piece moves back to Dorian, but this time D Dorian. One thing that Bloch uses often throughout this movement is accents. They're always used to emphasize the macro beat of a 6/8 measure. He uses tenutos on some of the dotted quarter notes to signal to the performer that he wants the phrase ending to be mildly elongated. Bloch wants this movement to be heavily articulated to fit the dance style. Again, slurs are used to show the precise phrasing. In the 2/4 section, the articulation markings are little to none. This is following the flow that has been previously established in the other movements. This movement also has a start that emanates power. This can be seen by the first forte dynamic that's introduced in the entire piece. Overall, there is a major dynamic contrast throughout the entire movement. Every time the main theme is played, it's meant to be loud and strong. The other parts are at mezzo piano to piano. This is evidence that the main theme is meant to stand out and come off as strong. Another thing that's worth noting is the Italian word ritmico, which translates to highly rhythmic. The performance marking, the accents, and the dynamic marking all work to emphasize the melody and give it a strong feeling. Then, Bloch adds even more to the contrast that's being created in the 2/4 section by putting an espressivo in it. This also allows for the section to fit the style of the prior movements. In addition to all this, Bloch chooses to use his letandos and ritardos sparingly. There is one that leads into the slower 2/4 section, and then we see another one 4 before rehearsal 16. This one is interesting because it's between two A sections. It also leads into an A tempo for a couple measures before the movement begins to gradually slow down to resolve. There's a lot happening in Movement 4. There are many different sections that all vary in tempo. This brings back many of the themes that were introduced to us in the prior movements. In general, this movement can be viewed as somewhat of a summary. This is what music theorists would call a cyclic work. This movement is also the most dramatic because it has various expressive choices, such as tempo and dynamics. This movement is interesting because it has its own introduction. This introduction matches the style of the thematic material in the prior movements. This introductory phrase is also repeated throughout the movement in contrast with the other material. From there, the piece enters the A section. Here, the tempo picks up and there are faster moving notes. From there, at rehearsal 18, the piece enters the B section. This is the same tempo as the prior section, but the rhythm changes. This all repeats again and goes introduction A, B. Then the movement ends with a coda. So a rough form of the movement would be introduction A, B, coda. Something that is specifically special about this movement is that we get to see elements from the earlier movements being expanded on. There are some places where the main theme was introduced and the movement 1 is being used as a transition piece. This happens at the end of the first introduction into the first A section, and then at the end of the second introduction into the first B section, or A section again. There are notes that are faster moving to create a build-up into the much faster sections to follow. Then, at rehearsal 23, which is arguably where the coda would start, the theme is completely based off the ideas that are presented in movement 1. Lastly, this piece ends with the melody that was introduced to us in movement 2. With everything that is happening in this movement, there's also a lot of different modal changes throughout. It is also interesting because there are key changes, which is not something that we've been seeing in the other movements. The introduction starts out in E minor. Then as the A section comes, the piece modulates into B minor. This transition is logical because it's a shift to the B, which would be a modulation to the dominant. After that, the B section shifts to C major, which is the first time anything has been major for the entire piece. As the introduction returns, the piece goes back to B minor. This movement remains in B minor during the second A section, then goes back to C minor for the second B section. Then, when the coda happens, the movement returns to E minor. Lastly, the ending. This is where the theme from movement 2 is introduced and is played in B minor, which is interesting because when it was first introduced, it was played in A Dorian. This is the first movement that introduces ornaments. They are little turns that exist to embellish the beginning and ends of the A sections. This is also interesting that Bloch decides to hold off using these ornaments because he was so inspired by Baroque compositions. Ornaments play a huge part of the Baroque era, especially when looking at flute music. At the same time, using the ornaments sparingly allows for them to stand out and add to the melody. There is also a wide variety of articulations that Bloch is adding to the piece. The articulations stay the same for the entire melody that he is quoting. The introduction phrases keep their slurs to fit the rest of the piece, whereas the A, B, and coda sections, there's still slurs present, but there's also the addition of accents and staccatos. This creates a sense of power that we saw in that third movement, but it still has that flowing feeling from the other movements, which this combination allows this movement to be its own. Now we move on to the legacy of Ernest Bloch. Ernest Bloch lived a long, fulfilling life. He passed away on July 15, 1959, at the age of 78 due to cancer in Portland, Oregon. He was extremely well respected and left behind a significant legacy when he died. His daughter and her husband chose to have many death masks made of him. A death mask is a casting that was made to honor one's death and dates back to the Middle Ages. There are 2 places that have copies of the death masks, which are the Center for Creative Photography and the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Bloch has 3 children, Ivan, Suzanne, and Lucien. Ivan became an engineer, and Bloch's 2 daughters took more creative routes and carried on their father's legacy. Suzanne both composed and taught music at Juilliard, and Lucien was a successful photographer that worked and photographed well-known artist Frida Kahlo. In addition to this, Lucien illustrated children's books. Here on the slide, we have a photo of Bloch and his children, and then the 2 bottom photos are artwork done by Lucien. Here is the photo of Frida Kahlo, and here is a painting, that mural that she made just to show the contrast of her art. And then at the top corner, we see a photo that Bloch took to show the influence that was made and how she ended up following in her father's footsteps. There are many other ways that this legacy continued and has been honored over the years. Bloch's home in Algate Beach has been listed on the National Register for Historical Places as of February 2009. There was also a memorial that was originally near Bloch's house but was moved to outside Newport Performing Arts Center in Newport, Oregon. In addition to this, there was also a street named after him, Bloch Palace, in Newport. In 1967, an Ernest Bloch Society was formed in the United States by his children. The society, which existed until 1991, published information about the performances and publications relative to Bloch, and material that came from his letters, notes, and pedagogical writings. There was also the Ernest Bloch Music Festival that was held from 1990 to 2006 and based in Newport, Oregon, which the state held to honor him during his final 18 years. In 2007, the multi-pronged Ernest Bloch Legacy Project was formed there. And in 2008, the International Ernest Bloch Society was established in London. All of these things are very relevant because they show how his legacy and how loved and respected of a composer he was. Throughout the life of Ernest Bloch, he had a lot of inspiration. He also had many creative outlets, which can be seen in both his photography and his composing. In suite modal specifically, he experimented with modes and expressive devices to make a beautiful piece. Since this piece was composed at the end of his life, this piece came from a lifetime's worth of inspiration and compositional techniques. And then here we have a quote from Ernest Bloch that says, "Real music goes beyond the inventions of its author, and for it nourishes itself from a much deeper and more mysterious source than mere intellect. It represents a synthesis of all the vital forces, of all of the hidden instincts of an individual."